Hi, class, and welcome to video chat number 3, the female divine, or film report number 3. So a few things I want to talk about. On this one, the kind of reference point is the work we did on Gilgamesh. And that second question that we looked at, where we looked at the female roles in that story, the female goddesses, and kind of discussed, okay, what are their attributes? What do they do in that society? What are they not allowed to do? In order to kind of get a picture of what gender roles look like in ancient Mesopotamia. So we're going to do something similar and or contrast that with the messages sent out by by popular culture today, specifically through the lens of 2 films. You can choose either one, either the movie Coraline or the movie The Wizard of Oz. It's okay also to select others. There's lots of other movies with a female heroine that would work here, but again, okay it with me ahead of time if you want to go another direction. So the idea of the female divine, that's an idea that comes, really it's around the mid part of the previous century that we get this idea of the female divine, and it's really the great goddess, or the triple goddess. In fact, that was one of the titles of one of the books. And originally the triple goddess was seen as a discovery, and looking at sort of the ancient mythology, specifically through Fraser's golden book, The Golden Bough. Some people studied that and concluded that they had found evidence that in the Paleolithic, remember that's prior to the Neolithic, this is when most human beings were hunter-gatherer societies, that in those cultures, it was the religion or myth was actually more female oriented, as well as social organization, that rulership, for example, was matrilineal rather than patrilineal or patriarchal. And the first idea of this was the idea of the triple goddess as Virgin Mother Crone. Feminists took issue with that and rightly so, suggesting that those are terms that define women through as a relationship to a male, and so those were changed. Gimbutas is the name here, an Indian scholar who came up with instead that the triple goddess is referencing life, death, and regeneration. And so they theorized about this, and there are really 2 primary points of evidence. One are the so-called Venus figurines. So this is archaeological evidence throughout the early Neolithic, and extending. We have a lot of these little tiny figurines. I'm going to put a link to that in the comments below, so you can get a look at these. That they're kind of pocket-sized, all about this size, and really 2 things stand out. Is one, hardly any of them have faces. If they have a head at all, it's often just a decorative sort of ornament of some sort. And then what does feature prominently are the reproductive organs, the breasts and the hips, which are enormous. And so they took this as evidence that this is that these Paleolithic cultures worshipped a goddess figure. And because we don't have a whole lot of similar male figures, that this is some evidence that this for these matrilineal societies. The other point of evidence, and probably the more convincing of the 2, is evidence that's come down to us through mythology. And we've already seen evidence of this to some degree, which is the evidence of this sort of battle of the sexes that we see in the early mythologies. We certainly see it in the Greek world, and primarily what we see there is an attempt, it's argued, for the male to appropriate the reproductive process from the female, right? So it's pretty easy to attribute the reproductive process to a female, because that's the literal body we come out of, is the mother. Takes some doing to say that that it's the male that's more important in that process. And we see that in the Greek world, for example, eventually the mother or the woman's role in that reproductive process was simply as a vessel. She was just, it was the magic sperm that that created the baby, and she was just a vessel to carry it until it was ready to come out and nothing more. So we see that in a lot of early myths. And we also see this division of what that was seen as a triple goddess figure, one figure that represented all three of these elements, that was dispersed into several different female characters. And so, in large part, it was argued to devalue or split up her power in some way. And then we see pantheons in which it's the male figure that is at the head of the gods rather than a female figure. Um, and in these early works that argue for these female cultures in the Paleolithic, we also have an idea of the ritual king, that the king that is married to this triple goddess figure, and it's through that marriage that things grow: spring, summer, fall, harvest season, and then the king would be sacrificed. And it was argued that originally that was a literal sacrifice, so being king wasn't so great because it meant you had only 1 year to live. And then it was argued by people like Robert Graves and other scholars that eventually these kings started to put others and have ritual or symbolic deaths so that they could maintain that power. And this is one of the ways that maybe we transition from matriarchal cultures to patriarchal cultures. So that's where we get the idea. Now, there's arguments against this. One is that there are non-female figurines that are found, and but there are much more that are indeterminate. It's hard to say whether they're male or female. And then the more common critique of this theory is that it sort of presents women as the inverse of what they're portrayed to be in male culture. So, in other words, that the female embodies nature, while the male becomes the sky and science and so forth. So it's sort of a mere reversal of a Victorian era science in a way. So that's a critique of that. I want to talk about just a few things. So anyway, that's where we get the concept. None of that is so important for your essays, but that's where the concept comes from. What we're going to explore in this film report is what we did with Gilgamesh. What do these films say about gender? How do they define it? What do they say a woman, in this case, is supposed to be, right? What are the values? What are the virtues she's supposed to have? And as importantly, or more importantly, what are the virtues that she's not supposed to have or isn't allowed to have, and that sort of thing. And so one way we can do that is by looking at the female archetypes, and that can be a method we use for exploring this. And one thing we can look at is why some female archetypes dominate in some eras and other female archetypes dominate in others. And let me kind of read those out for you real quickly. There are 6 primary female archetypes. You can find more about this in your text if you look this up in the index. But the first one is the warrior. It was 2 mythologists named Wulger and Wulger who came up with these primary archetypes, and they used the Greeks as their examples. So the warrior was represented by Athena, at least in Greek culture. Next was the huntress archetype, which was represented by the Greek goddess Artemis. Next, the love or lover archetype, which was, of course, Aphrodite. The next was the queen archetype, which was Hera, Zeus's wife. And the mistress of the dead, in this case, that was represented by Persephone. There are probably better examples than Persephone in other mythological systems. But that's the Greek one. And then finally, the mother archetype, which is represented in the Greek pantheon by Demeter. And then it's equally interesting that those primary 6 are divided into 3 dyads. And the idea that Woolger and Woolger came up with is that on one, that there were really, while we have 6 archetypes, there are really 3 different powers, potencies, to use the original word for an archetype. But their divide is those same potencies um, go, used either for public or for private, right? And so in the first dyad, what we have is for the warrior and the huntress, and that's Athena, who represents the kind of warrior female spirit in public or for the civilized world, and in the wild world, it's Artemis, the huntress, that represents that same force, right? Likewise, pure power is represented in the civilized world by Hera, and that same force is represented in the wild world by Persephone, or the mistress of the dead. And then finally, the love archetype is represented by Demeter. And so the suggestion, at least for the Greeks, this works, is that the public expression of female love is appropriate only with motherly love, and the wild representation of that is Aphrodite, the lustful kind of thing. So that's something that we can use. Remember that they argue that these aren't stereotypes, but images for diverse behaviors that condition women's relationship to others within society, right? So for both Woolger and Woolger, these aren't Jungian concepts as much as they are socially constructed things, socially constructed ideas about what it means to be a woman, that therefore shape what it means to be a woman, right? And so one thing that I think then is interesting about that is you look, for example, the mother archetype, which, as we just talked about, in the Greek world, that was and for a lot of Western history, that's the appropriate role that a female can have. And one of the articles that I've linked you to for this particular assignment is called "Why Are All the Cartoon Mothers Dead?" So one of the things I think we're seeing in our culture today is that the mother archetype has a lot less value. People are told today, or not people, women are told in our culture today, not so much to be mothering, although that's still a role, but the argument is in that article, as well as the article on Coraline, which is the same old other mother, is that role has been devalued in place of the warrior archetype. And I think you certainly see this in the film world today. I just watched the latest Star Wars film last night with our kids, a female heroine. It's sort of so we see that kind of warrior archetype dominating in our culture today, much more so than the mothering archetype. We might even argue that the mothering archetype has been um, um, degraded, as something that's looked down upon. And so why? And one of the real contrasts between these two films is I think you can look at Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz as very much a mothering figure, but it's a mothering figure that ends up dominating, at least in the books. There's a critical change from the books to the movie. The writer of the books he was married to a suffragist, and his mother was a suffragist, so he was quite involved in that movement. And one of the things that takes place in the books that doesn't take place in the film is that Dorothy stays in the land of Oz and she becomes the queen. She rules over Oz, right? And if you see the film, you'll see that's not what happens. In fact, she goes back to her home, and it's all a dream. And is there a message there about, is no place like home being that's where women belong? And it's a small change, but I would argue a very important one from the film to the books that they're based upon. So I think that's worth noting. So a few other things. It just, in terms of the assignment, I haven't listed all of the readings, but there are a few other readings I think that are besides the one that Zara mentioned, which are Hunger Games and mythology and the Zizek Courbet article. there's a big, huge, it's a quite famous essay, book length essay called How to Read Donald Duck. And even though we're not utilizing Donald Duck here, it's really a critique of the Disney World in particular. And it's a great example of how we can use artifacts from popular culture to read into cultural hegemony. So, well worth reading. I think I've put 2 articles on that. One, I think, is just the Wikipedia explanation of it, because probably none of you have time to read that whole thing. But it's well worth the time, I think, to take a quick look if you can muster in a little extra time. And then I've already mentioned Why Are All the Other Mothers Dead? That's on Coraline. Even if you're gonna go the Wizard of Oz route, I think that's still a good article to read. As I mentioned in my announcement for the last one, all of you did Harry Potter, and that's fine. But the Star Wars articles, I think, do a good job of showing how to utilize the films to interpret cultural hegemony. And I might say this too. It's really Film Report 3, when I start to see students who start to pick up on the skill that I'm trying to teach you this semester. So fingers crossed that happens this one. But the other reason I mentioned that is to sort of soften your frustrations if you're having them. It is a difficult thing. This is a new way to watch movies for all of you, I'm sure, and it takes a little practice to get there. So what I recommend a lot of times is after this film report, if I start to see evidence that students are picking up on it, that's a good time to go back and redo some of those earlier ones. Okay. So as it says in the prompt, I want you to compare and contrast these 2 films, the females and the female archetypes in these 2 films, with 2 other myths that feature female heroines. Goose Girl, Nuqua, Cupid and Psyche, Medusa, Demeter and Persephone, or others mentioned in the pages from chapters 1, 10, 29, 37, 39, and 40 that are listed. So something from the book or something else outside the book. If you come from a different culture and you're well familiar with the mythologies of your culture and want to deal with that, that's terrific. So by all means, feel free to do something like that. One other thing, if you go online, you'll find a lot of stuff on the Wizard of Oz about how it's a metaphor for gold standard versus silver standard and stuff like that. And not that that's necessarily a bad analysis or anything. It's just that I don't think it's very useful for our purposes. So there's some interesting interpretation there, but it's really not interpreting the gender dynamic of the film or dealing with the female divine, which is what I want you to focus on for this film. I think that's about it. As always, shoot me a question via email if you have any difficulties with this or just want a question answered. And again, I think just kind of as a way in, I'm finding that, I'm finding the online discussions just not as valuable as what we can do in class, and I'm not sure how to compensate for that, other than to kind of talk more in these that I normally do when I do a mini in-class lecture. And so one of the things I do want to kind of point out is that kind of modern female heroine that's becoming more and more predominant, which is sort of this female who, kind of kicks ass and takes names in a super sexy body, usually, right? So this sort of morphing between kind of the Aphrodite archetype with the warrior Athena archetype. Why is that dominant? What's changed in our culture to make that be the way we want and expect women to behave in our culture versus behaving and acting as a mother figure? And going back to the Wizard of Oz, that subtle change that it's all a dream and she goes back home is quite significant. One thing you might question here is what would a world look like if it were governed by, say, a mother archetype, right? We could argue, I think, that the warrior female archetype, the warrior slash lover, um, isn't going to disrupt the the social order that we live under today, right? But if you put a mother in charge, something is radically different there. But probably most of you didn't grow up in a family environment that looks a lot like the world that we inhabit as adults. Your mother doesn't put you probably didn't put you in competition with your siblings to see who would get the most food that night based on how well you can competed at some activity or something. But that's the world we live in, right? And so it would be radically different. That might help explain um, some of what's going on in regards to the um, um, derogatory um, um, way that the mother archetype is being presented in our culture. Um, so I think that's it. Probably I feel like I'm forgetting to say something, and I'll end up putting it in the announcements a little bit later. But again, I hope you're all well. I know that one of you has already reached out to me and has been sick, um, so I hope you recover soon, and I hope the rest of you stay healthy and safe and get through this semester okay, and that we'll see each other in person down the line at some point. So thanks everybody, and until the next video lecture. Bye.